In this lecture, we'll be looking at two religions that are indigenous to China. The first is the Tao or Taoism, and the other is Zhujiao or Rujiao, which is better known as the teachings of Confucius.
Okay, if we go back to the most ancient form of religion that we find within China, we see that there is a great deal of reverence for ancestors. You are to honor and glorify your family that has gone on the generations before you. You will oftentimes offer prayers, burn incense, make some sort of offering to the ancestor. When we get to our first historically identifiable dynasty, we refer to the Shangdi dynasty, and the temple pictured here was a representation of the god Shangdi, belonging actually to the Shang dynasty. And the belief was that Shangdi was a very personal god with a lot of power, sort of a classic traditional image of a deity. But a big change takes place when we move from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty. That's not listed here, Z-H-O-U, the Zhou dynasty. And here, rather than believing that the god was a personal being like Shangdi pictured here, we start to see the Chinese people refer to an impersonal heaven as the primary deity. And Tian, or heaven, is seen as selecting who the leader will be. So whatever dynasty is in power, that is the dynasty, that is the emperor that has been selected by this impersonal Tian of heaven. Now, throughout all of existence, one is trying to get his or her body attuned to the sort of heavenly energy or force. And this energy that is everywhere present within the creation is referred to as Qi or Qi. And we have a particular balance that we will see within this energy, and that is called the yin and the yang. The yin is seen as a very dark, receptive female power, and the yang is seen as a very light, male, aggressive power. And these two things are held in balance. Neither one is seen to be negative or positive in and of itself, but it is the balance between the two that creates a positive path of energy. And if you do find that balance of energy in your life, then you are said to be living in the correct way, living on the correct path. And that path is referred to as the Tao. And of course, the Tao is the name given to this first of two primary forms of religion within China. Here is your primary symbol, the yin and the yang, that you can see here at the top. I'll say more about these broken and whole lines surrounding the yin and the yang in just a moment. The primary way of trying to discern what the Tao is in your life is to use a manual called the I Ching or the Yi Jing. Sorry that there are two pronunciations for many of these terms. In scholarship for many generations, there was a way of pronouncing terms, and of course most of you know there's no such thing as a Chinese language. There is a Mandarin language and a Cantonese language. And with these two, this is why we have some various pronunciations for these terms. So sorry, I know that brings about confusion, but that is the reality. So the Yi Jing or the I Ching is a process of taking 6 coins or 6, what I guess we would call toothpicks today, and you would throw them down on a table or on the ground, and you would see what the combination of heads and tails is, or whether the toothpicks fall more horizontally or vertically. And you would go through that process several times, usually 6 times, and this would give you a pattern of heads and tails or vertical or horizontal lines. And then you would look up in the I Ching in the manual what result you got from these tossing of the coins or toothpicks. Very similar to the idea that you all know that you see with a fortune cookie today. There would be some sort of advice or counsel given within the I Ching. Now, the primary teacher of the Tao is Lao Tzu, and Lao Tzu will author a text called the Tao Te Ching that is seen as the primary, I guess you would say, a scriptural text for this tradition. It is said that when Lao Tzu was a very old man, around 160, that he left his work in China to just live the rest of his days out in the forest, and as he was leaving, there was a border agent that asked the 160-year-old Lao Tzu to please write down his wisdom, And this wisdom consists of exactly 5,000 words and is this manual called this book of scripture called the Tao Te Ching. The primary second generation leader for the Tao is Zhuangzi, and he is seen as providing very light-hearted and humorous commentary on the teachings of Lao Tzu. And again, all of these are instructions for how to find the right balance in life. And much of what Zhuangzi will write about that makes him humorous is he stresses that we take ourselves far too seriously, and if we could be more lighthearted, then we would discover the right balance of energy and therefore discover the Tao in our lives. We also see that the Tao is similar to Buddha Dharma, and that's not surprising because Buddha Dharma has many adherents within China. As a matter of fact, the religious reality for most Chinese people is it is very difficult, if not impossible, to separate the Tao from Buddha Dharma. The two are so intertwined with one another. But the similarity comes in that both of these religions stress moderation rather than going to extremes of luxury or deprivation. And then two primary virtues to have down in your notes here for the Tao. Wu Wei, I'll give you a very strange translation for what Wu Wei is, and then I'll try to explain, although it is somewhat difficult. Wu Wei means inactive activity. Okay, inactive activity. And the best I can do with this is to say rather than continuing to stress oneself out and overexerting oneself to try to accomplish something, sometimes we just need to be still, we need to be inactive, and in that inactivity we will discover the activity of the key, the divine energy, and then we will better be able to discern the Tao of our life. So in other words, the need to be still, the need to be inactive to therefore discover the activity of the key. And then Feng Shui here is simply paying attention to nature, and that if you will pay attention to the harmony that nature has, such as the flow of a river, or the way that a particular tree is growing, by observing nature and seeing the path of nature, you would be able to discover the correct path, the correct Tao for your own life. We do, of course, as with any religion, have a distinction with different Tao practices depending on how educated a particular person or particular family is. But for those who live in poverty, and maybe even those who are illiterate, we do have folk Tao practices. Okay, so this would be the majority of people that don't have access to the more sophisticated and nuanced forms of the Tao. And within folk Tao, we have various gods or goddesses that are recognized. I want to give you just one example here, and that is the kitchen god. The kitchen god has a statue that would be placed up in the corner of the kitchen, which would be the most popular room for the family because cooking would take so much longer, and is certainly a place where the family gathers to do work in the kitchen. And so the kitchen god is seen as watching your family, making sure that they're behaving and doing the right thing. And the belief was that once a year, the kitchen god would ascend up into Tian, would go up into heaven, and would make a report about how your family was behaving. And kind of the idea with Santa Claus, whether you've been naughty or whether you've been nice. And so a report is given in heaven about your family. Now, some of the humorous stories that go along with the kitchen god are that Chinese families will often try to trick the kitchen god before he goes to make his annual report, such as giving him liquor so that he is drunk and not able to make an accurate report, or feeding him peanut butter so that the tongue will stick to the roof of his mouth and he won't be able to give an accurate report because he can't use his tongue to speak and report on your family. As we move into the more educated and sophisticated forms of the Tao, we do see a few schools develop. I have 3 listed here. I'm actually going to give you 4, so make sure you write down the additional one. The Celestial Master School is the belief that Tian, or heaven, has granted wisdom of the Tao to a particular individual, and so therefore that individual would be your master. Celestial is a term referring to heaven, so that's a fairly easy one to understand. One particular individual is blessed by the heavens, blessed by Tian, and this wisdom is imparted to its patriarchal, so almost always him, to teach you the wisdom of the Tao. This school was scoffed at by a later school called the Highest Purity School. and feeling that by exalting one individual over the others, that was missing the whole purpose of the Tao. And so highest purity Taoists are those who gather together and they strive to discover where the Tao would be in their lives, what that right path would be. And by discovering the Tao, they therefore would purify their souls. And then eventually we come to the numinous treasure school of the Tao. And this is the numinous spiritual. So there is a spiritual treasure within everyone. And the Tao would be the teachings and the practices and the rituals that you would undergo to discover and have that treasure come about in your life. The numinous treasure school eventually began to fade away and evolved into your fourth and final school, the one not listed here, and that is the school of complete perfection. And so many of the teachings that you have in Numinous Treasure about following the Tao to discover this treasure within you, those teachings are then borrowed by what is the most recent and probably the most sophisticated form of the Tao today, and that again was the school of complete perfection. When we look at present day Taoism, we see that there is a great deal of emphasis between connecting the physical and the spiritual aspects of life together. The primary physical practice, you all have probably seen this in a TV show or a movie, is called Tai Chi Chuan, usually just shortened to Tai Chi. And Tai Chi, you can see some folks involved in that at the bottom left picture here. It is a very slow moving postures that will try to achieve physical balance in difficult stances, and by achieving that physical balance you would hopefully come to spiritual balance. And as far as the Tao in China today is concerned, we do know that in 1949 we have an officially atheist government take over with Chairman Mao. And because there had this officially atheist government, we eventually see a cultural revolution take place in the decade from 1966 to 1976, in which all practices of the Tao were outlawed and despised. But since 1976, we have seen a slow resurgence of the indigenous religion of the Tao, and the Tao is actually one of only 5 religions that is recognized as allowable in China today. The primary place where the Tao is taught today is pictured here. It's the White Cloud Temple in Beijing. Just if you're curious and want to know what the other 5 tolerated or the other 4 tolerated religions, of course we begin with the Tao, and then of course Buddha Dharma is also recognized as an allowable religion, and Islam has a population of 6 million Chinese in northwest China. And then Christianity is divided into Catholicism and Protestantism, and those are the last 2 forms that are tolerated or allowed. The Chinese government, rather than continuing to persecute and stamp out religious groups, has decided to allow these 5, believing that eventually people will evolve and see that religion is meaningless and they will voluntarily give up their religion. So no longer is there an active persecution against those religious groups, but instead the belief that eventually people will come to the realization that religion is meaningless and will fall in line with the government stance, which is atheist. Now, that is certainly indigenous and important to Chinese culture, but is still frowned upon greatly by the atheist government, are the teachings of Confucius, or Zhujiao. Confucius belonged to a family that had been very important and prominent during the Shang dynasty, but when the Zhao dynasty took over, Confucius' family fell out of favor. There was a great deal of mistreatment that took place toward Confucius and his people, and therefore he tried to bring about some teachings that were drawing upon the oldest and most ancient Chinese teachings to try to restore some order to society when everything seemed to be in upheaval. Because the primary stress of Confucius' teachings are on political, societal, and moral order, a lot of people will refer to the teachings of Confucius as much more of a philosophy than a religion. But eventually, the teachings of Confucius will become intertwined with the teachings of the Tao and Buddha Dharma, and become so integrated with those that this is why we teach the words of Confucius as a religion. The primary virtue that is stressed in the teachings of Confucius is the term Ren, and Ren can be translated many different ways, but primarily it is love of goodness. It is what true humanity is intended to be. And so Confucius focused upon, we already see being here intertwined with the Tao, he focused on the I Ching, okay, the manual of discerning the Tao, balance, that right path for life. He taught the importance of Li and later Yi. That's Li and Yi, and you need to have those terms down in your notes also. This is a proper and right conduct in family and in society, that you learn and know your place and you fulfill your obligations and your responsibilities. Okay, it's Li and Yi. But again, Ren is that primary virtue. As a matter of fact, in the writings of Confucius, he said that there are only three things that a good political leader must have to be successful. Adequate food for the people, adequate troops, okay, adequate military to protect the territory, and then third and finally and most importantly is the trust of the people. And then Confucius would go on to write, during difficult times when there may not be enough food or the military may be weak, a leader can still remain strong if he has the trust of the people during that difficult time. And the only way that a leader can have the trust of the people is if he embodies this virtue of Ren, this love of goodness, this true spirit of humanity. A big part of Ren is therefore selflessness, that you live your life in such a way that you're not self-serving, but you're seeking to serve others. And the teachings of Confucius, although not recognized during his lifetime as being of great importance, it will be later generations that pick up his teachings, and that is when the teachings of Confucius become forever integrated into the culture and life of China. A next generation leader is Mingzi, and Mingzi certainly stressed that virtue of Confucius, of Yi, that right conduct toward one another. And really, just to help you differentiate in your notes here a bit between that other term, Li, and Yi, Li would be the particular rituals that you would perform to honor your ancestors and show reverence to them. And so as you perform the rituals of Li, that results in the right conduct in your relationships, which is Yi. So you see the two do overlap, but there is that slight distinction of the rituals being performed and then the right conduct and relationships with one another being Yi. The second generation leader, Mingzi, sometimes called Mencius, but Mingzi taught that humanity is basically good, and we need to observe the teachings of Confucius just to help us take that one more step in the right direction to become more of what we should be. But again, Mingzi primarily stressed that humanity is basically good, just missing one small part of life to restore all of our relationships to being right. But by the time we get to the next generation, we see great upheaval taking place within Chinese political power, and certainly overthrows of dynasties have been taking place. And so this next generation leader, Zunzi, will continue with the teachings of Confucius, but he will be much less optimistic about human nature, and he will teach that human nature is completely broken and must cling to the teachings of Confucius to be put back together again. Okay, and the reason that we certainly refer to Confucius' teachings as a religion today is because in the late 12th century, and more so especially into the 13th century, we see that the teachings of Confucius become intertwined with the teachings of the Tao. And we have Chinese teachers that are wanting to make sure that the Chinese people have an understanding of the uniqueness of what it means to be Chinese. And so an entire curriculum was created in schools, from what we would call elementary all the way through junior high, high school, and even into college. And this curriculum was based upon this combination of the teachings of Confucius and the Tao. And although not done as intentionally, certainly many teachings of the Buddha Dharma were there also. But this was an integration within school curriculum, educational curriculum, of these three religions altogether. And that is termed in scholarship as Neo-Confucianism once we have all of these integrated together. This is Chinese identity then, from this late 12th century all the way through the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th. And then we get to the 20th century and we have the last empire is overthrown. The last dynasty is overthrown early in the 20th century. And China struggles for an identity for a few decades before in 1949 China becomes a communist nation under Chairman Mao. And Mao despises religion, but especially despises the political philosophy of Confucius and describes it as belonging to the old China, and attempts to replace the writings of Confucius with his own little red book. He had a red book with his own philosophy for a new China, in which he tries to overcome Confucius' teachings about societal order, and especially the ideas of knowing one's place and having someone else put obligations and responsibilities upon you. So moving away from that very communal sense of responsibility that Confucius taught to a more individualistic understanding of the purpose of life within China under Chairman Mao.